All right, folks, welcome to our very first episode of Decoding Data Leadership. Today, we're going to be debating to catalog or not to catalog. That is the question. My name is Maggie Hays. I'm the founding community product manager of Data Hub, here to help with some moderation, keep the conversation going. But most importantly, let's bring in our esteemed guests to join us today. So we will do a quick round of intros. Ms. Taylor, I will start with you. Please introduce yourself.
Sure, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Taylor Brownlow. I am currently head of data and product at Count.co. For that, I spent most of my early career in data as a data analyst and data scientist. And then about 4 years ago, moved over to Count on the vendor side to try to build something to help out data teams there.
Amazing. Welcome. And Mr. Benn.
Hey, I'm Benn Stancil. I am also background as a data person, an analyst, or data scientist, or whatever you want to call it. 10 years ago, started a company called Mode. It's basically a BI tool designed around data teams. And then we were recently joined ThoughtSpot, which is another BI tool that's basically AI-powered analytics and sort of an AI-driven BI tool. So currently I'm now the field CTO at ThoughtSpot, and we'll leave it to your imagination as to what that means.
That sounds extremely official. Congratulations. Keep us posted on what that means. I'm actually very curious.
Nobody knows what it means.
Yeah, right? All right. And last but not least, Shirshanka, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shirshanka Das, co-founder and CTO at Acryl. Been doing this gig for, almost 3 years now, Maggie, although it feels like 10 years. But prior to this, I was at LinkedIn for another 10 years, but really 10 years this time. And I was responsible for a lot of things, including saying no to analysts many times. And so I have a lot of sins accumulated up from that. Central data platform teams do that. And as part of that, I ended up building a system called Data Hub that does show up as a data catalog in the modern stack. So super happy to be here, and more happy that we're finally kicking off this show that we've talked about for many months and years now.
Yeah, it's a long time coming. All right. So we have
wait a minute, Maggie.
What's that?
You introduce yourself?
I did at the beginning, but I'll do one more introduction. So my background is also in all things data analytics, data science, analytics engineering, BI engineering, data products. Kind of if it exists, I've probably tried it successfully or otherwise. We'll see. But most recently joined the Acryl team in 2021. So it's been a little bit over 2 years as the founding product manager, community manager for the Data Hub community, and also the combination of community-led product development and product development for Acryl's managed offering for Data Hub. So I will be ideally an unbiased participant in this, just keeping the conversation moving forward. So if you start to feel that I'm introducing bias, hit the buzzer or something, I don't know, and we'll go from there. So the topic for today is to catalog or not to catalog. We are all coming from collective decades of experience in the data space. Data catalogs are not a new thing. They've been around since companies have been using data. But how they kind of manifest or how people actually deploy them, the tools they use, the problems they're solving with them, those continue to evolve as our modern data offering also rapidly evolves. So to kind of like ground ourselves a little bit, I'd love for each of you to kind of give a 1 to 2 sentence, like your interpretation of what do we even mean by a data catalog? Taylor, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. I think data catalog is a place to document data. So what data columns mean, what the lineage is, where that data is being used. I think often it's a place for people unfamiliar with the data to understand, hopefully, how they can use it and use it well, I guess is a key word there.
Yeah. Ben, any divergent thoughts there?
No, it's a theoretical place full of theoretical information that is theoretically useful.
Yeah.
Hot take number 1. All right. Shirshanka, what about you? What are your thoughts there?
I think it's very interesting for BI people to not like data catalogs. because the data catalog actually represents the warehouse of all metadata that exists. And it actually offers kind of a exploration experience on top of this combined information. So documentation is definitely part of the story, but it's actually more about information, um, literally building an information schema for your entire enterprise and then making it accessible to the technical as well as non-technical persona. That's, I think, my take on what a data catalog is. And of course, it's two pieces, the information that backs it and then the experience on top.
So I'm curious, Shirshanka, with that, like in kind of the modern data catalog, who are the types of data practitioners that actually benefit from it, right? So Ben kind of touched on it's theoretically useful. There's theoretically information in there. Who are the target personas that not only implement, I mean, implementation detail aside, but who actually benefits from it?
There's definitely multiple personas that need to be targeted by this one tool. And that's kind of, in my experience, the secret to its success. If you only target one persona, then you only get limited success to one team or one kind of role. So I've seen, multiple implementations of data catalogs that have been successful. And in pretty much all of those cases, there has been a focus on the non-technical user. So the thing that Taylor brought up, like, I want to understand the definition of this metric. I want to understand like how it's computed and things like that. But also the technical persona that's actually going in and saying, did my metric definition did my pipeline run? Did it produce good data? Did it actually do what I expected it to do? And then even further upstream of that, the production engineer who's actually working on perhaps the online application, being able to see, I've got this MySQL table over here and I'm about to make a small change to it. What's it going to impact? So if you can actually cater to all of these different personas, then you actually have something that's sticky and useful.
Mm-hmm. And so Ben, with that in mind, or maybe you want to bounce somewhere else, like who are the personas that stand to benefit the most but tend to benefit the least?
I mean, I would agree that there's like every persona in theory benefits, that analysts benefit in theory because they're the ones like who are trying to do analysis on top of the stuff and need to understand how the stuff works and like what the data means. And, here's a new column. How do I interpret it? Sort of the end users or end stakeholders in theory benefit because they're trying to look up when we say, net revenue retention, what does that mean? And all the sort of weird nuances that go into that. And how do I calculate that in theory would be in the same place too. I think that the, to the point a moment ago about like, it's weird that the BI people aren't sort of pro data catalog. I think that the reason for that to me is like, because we've been burned by them a lot, that it's not so much that like the abstract idea is bad. It's more of like, data catalogs and have all that information, but it's often kind of out of date or you can't rely on it or it's incomplete or whatever. And so the challenge is not like, hey, I don't think that it's a good product. The challenge is it's a dictionary that doesn't ever seem to quite match what reality is. And so I think that's where like my skepticism about it or like my feeling burned about it is more of like, yeah, I would love to have one. I've just never seen it. There was a point I think you made about like, it's an information schema. There is also an information schema in databases that tells you like what the columns are. And that one I can count on because it is like generated automatically, reliably by the database. If we had an information schema that was also all this other information that was as reliable as like information schema.tables, absolutely, I would love that. But that's the thing that we don't seem to have is the reality of that actual thing.
Yeah. And I think, that must be a lived reality for folks that are watching, right? Where it's like, I need this information. I go to this place. What is there does not match the reality, is out of date, it's stale, etc. So I'm curious, either Ben or maybe Taylor, like how have you seen, if we kind of think about, kind of the not to catalog, like how is that solved from a tooling perspective, from a culture perspective? I don't know what the kind of right lens is, but that is a very real problem, right? The speed at which a company moves, the speed at which data is generated, new sources are generated, transformed, dumped somewhere, presented, whatever. That's moving so rapidly. So I don't know, like if a static catalog that's ideally updated on, a regular cadence, if that tooling is unreliable, what's an alternative? Like how have you seen folks kind of counter that or kind of start to address that problem?
Yeah, I think just to add on the piece about it being, maybe incorrect, I think it's also very incomplete. I think a lot of times when people come to a data catalog, they don't just need technical definitions. I think they need a lot of context about why decisions were made. And that's also very hard to keep up to date and to explain at the right level of detail. So I think on that, the best way I've seen that kind of transfer of knowledge to actually take place is just via a call or a meeting, or it seems very analog, but the teams I've seen who put that in place to have okay, business team, we're going to set up like a regular meeting every week. We go over your metrics, we explain them to you. And then that over time, that discussion develops and they eventually get a very deep and rich understanding of that data. I think there's no kind of replacing that interaction that needs to happen just in person. And I think if a catalog is used to replace that interaction, it's gonna no one's really gonna be happy. And I think that's a lot of the issues that you have. If it's used to facilitate that discussion, I think it can be actually very helpful. But if it's used as a replacement for actually having relationships and conversations with people, I think that's a lot of the issues that we find. But to me, that's gotta be the main thing that you're doing is finding a way to have those discussions. And I think a lot of the other issues with data catalogs kind of become less important once you have that set up.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with all that, and I think basically the only times I've seen sort of this be successful is essentially it's a tribal knowledge kind of thing. It's people just kind of absorb it in some way. There's a kind of secondary effect to that to me that I actually think is kind of beneficial, and in some ways it becomes a little bit jumbled with data catalogs. Is basically if you have to do it that way, you also get a much more narrow set of things that you're trying to actually make sure people are aware of. You recognize people aren't going to remember 1,000 metrics. And so it ends up being the vocabulary that you're trying to talk to people with becomes much more constricted because it has to be. And I actually think that's kind of a useful dynamic that's not sort of ideal to do this all through tribal knowledge. But if you do successfully do it through tribal knowledge, essentially what happens is the scope of what you're trying to talk about becomes much more narrow. And I think that's in a lot of ways a good thing for companies to stay focused and stuff like that. So there are some benefits to me of doing it that way. It'd be better if we had sort of proper documentation and all that, and you can look everything up. But absent that, I don't think it's necessarily all that bad because the sort of corrective mechanisms are actually kind of a good thing in some ways.
Yeah, I think funnily enough, I'm actually in that same camp of saying that the data catalog is there just to remove unnecessary conversations and to ensure that only the highest quality conversations happen. So, the simple stuff like where did this stuff come from? All the stuff that you can actually get out of technical systems automatically today, right? Let's not try to discover that through tribal knowledge. And who do I even talk to? Oftentimes we see teams that are kind of a couple of hops upstream of your direct team. But if you really have a question about a particular event schema that is, 5 hops upstream of you, you can actually find the team that owns that event schema and then set up that high value call. Those are kind of the things that we think about in terms of what are we here for doing. We're really about connecting consumers to the producers, but only for the highest value conversations. And for everything else, you can just self-serve using the information that's in there. And I mean, to Benn's point, I think a lot of the complaints about information being stale or out of date or being wrong is conflated between technical information being stale and outdated, and then also curated, documented, human-generated information being stale or outdated. I think on the technical front, I feel like the industry has made a lot of improvements. And so now I think most of the modern data catalogs are able to pull metadata out or have metadata pushed into them as quickly as data gets generated. And so at least technical metadata-wise, I feel like we're in a pretty good spot as an industry. Now, on the human context capturing part and then being able to reflect that, that's been an age-old challenge even for software documentation, right? And I think some of our attempts at trying to shift left and have documentation live alongside code have kind of proven to be a little more durable than others. And I think some of those combination of those techniques are kind of able to keep information as current and as live as it needs to be.
My question would be like, what do you mean by technical metadata, and is that useful? Like, what? I'm not sure exactly what that is, and I'm not sure when that. Great, like, good, we have it, but what is that? What does that actually mean?
Technical metadata is information about the assets that you have in a system. So, for example, if you're looking at Kafka, for example, it would be the topics that exist in Kafka. If you're looking at a database, it would be the tables in the database and the schemas and things like that. But related to that is the lineage, which usually you don't get in an information schema. So how was this table derived from an upstream table or an upstream topic or an upstream data lake folder? And what was the process used to transform it? Was it a Spark job or an Airflow task? And what was the logic behind it? So those kind of things I consider technical metadata.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
I pulled up a question from the LinkedIn live chat, kind of touching on this a little bit, right? Where there's just a vast variety of metadata to be cataloged, technical, business process, authorization, quality, et cetera. And so I think, Shirshanka, I don't know, do you want to touch on that a little bit more of like, when we vaguely or broadly talk about technical metadata, where does that reach? How far does that reach, right?
Yeah, I think technical generally, these are all, honestly, you'll probably find slightly varying definitions of them if you go read up a few different white papers. But I've usually approached technical as being stuff that actually is native in a system and means something in that system. So if you look at a relational database, technical metadata includes the tables, the schemas, the privileges, the roles, and all of that stuff, the stuff that you actually get by querying, the information schema. If you move slightly upstream into, event-oriented systems or even operational systems, technical metadata might even include API definitions, and it might even include things like GraphQL schemas and things like that.
I'm curious, so like with all that in mind, like Taylor and Ben, do analysts care? Right? Like all of the technical metadata that we can capture, is that meaningful? Is it like, does it matter?
I think a piece of all of this to me is like a very emotional need to control and kind of, not really control, but like manage a lot of this and save it and keep it and like preserve it. And I think that just comes out of the fact that it's very overwhelming to just like think about all the information that we have and all the knowledge that we have about it. And so I think with that overwhelming feeling, we want to kind of commit it and save it and keep it. And it helps us like make us think it's able, more manageable. I think we kind of have to give up on that objective. It's just, we're never going to have it all. We're never going to keep all that information that we have. It's never going to be as accessible as we want it to be. I think we have to think about it instead as like, what is the most important thing that we need to keep? And so I think to your point, no, probably not. I think, but we do need to ask ourselves in different situations, what of that is the most important thing? What is the thing? If this is about helping my stakeholders be really competent in using data that I provide for them, what of those things is the most important that they need? Or if this is about analysts trying to understand new tables and columns, what of that information is most important to them? Or if it's about something else, then I think you've got to just make that choice and say, like, we can't have it all. Just pick what you think is the most important thing and then optimize on that.
Yeah. And so, in the absence of having a kind of a catalog, and again, I'm asking for folks that are in the audience that, may have that kind of definition in their mind of, these are the parts of metadata that I care about. In the absence of a catalog solution, what have you seen be successful in terms of kind of like putting that into practice, right? Where we collect it and here's how we use it.
Yeah, again, I think it comes back to which of those people, which of those interactions you're trying to optimize for will have different solutions. I think on the the side of kind of working with stakeholders so they feel confident in that. I think, the tool itself means less than the process that you have in place. But I think anything where I think it's more about opening the door to have that discussion at the right point in time. And then whatever you use to have that discussion is up to you. And I think based on those discussions, you'll build up what you need. So if in one conversation they say, I don't understand this metric, then you explain the metric. They don't understand why that metric had a weird spike, then you now add that and you say, well, now we have this spike at this point. And you kind of just build it up over time. And I think a lot of tools are capable of doing that now with embedding. And you can build some very basic things first. And then you see what you really need and what really works. And then you can think about scaling it. And maybe that means you get a full-blown data catalog. Maybe it means you don't. But you kind of build it up and you build what you need. That makes sense.
So I want to take this and kind of with that in mind, right? Because I think that's a really great way to think through, do things that don't scale, right? Do things that work well for this set of stakeholders, start to collect and synthesize and kind of curate for a specific, use case or whatever. I'm curious, Ben and Taylor, at what point, what are the points of consideration that you would take, what would you consider when thinking should I even bring in a catalog? Is it time?
So that's a tough question. My view of this is the point of a catalog, the point of all this stuff is really to answer two questions. It's what does this mean and can I trust it? It's basically, okay, you see a table or you're trying to figure out, I see a thing. How do I actually interpret it? What's the sort of meaning behind this thing? And can I actually trust what I'm seeing? I think that overwhelmingly those things are things that are answered basically by what behaviors other people follow. What does this mean to some extent is just going to be pulled out of the definitions of where it came from and things like that. But honestly, the technical information that you get there isn't always enough because you still need to know, there's going to be some source that has to be explained to you somehow. Okay, there's an event stream. I don't actually know if this event stream is something I can count on or if it means what I think it means. And then can I trust it is to some degree, are the green lights on a dashboard green? Has it been updated, stuff like that? But really the thing that says, can I trust it is, do other people who I trust it too? Really the thing that I would check to be can I trust this thing is, well, it goes into an executive dashboard that everybody's been looking at for the last 9 months. Probably can trust that because I assume that number is right. And so it's a little bit more of just trust gets built on top of existing trust of the same thing. And so to me, the question of when do you use a data catalog or when would you want one, it's when you've kind of solved some of those problems and the organization already has some of that inherent trust. It already has an understanding roughly of what to use. And you just need a place to be able to say, hey, we just need a place to sort of write down all these things somewhere so that people can reference it quickly. I don't know that you can solve if the problem with the data catalog is meant to solve is trust in data and discoverability and governance and all those things. I think actually in some ways data catalogs are the things you bring in after you have that becomes sort of a resource into finding the things that people already trust rather than nobody trusts it. Let's give it a data catalog and now we can teach people to trust it. It's no, the trust comes first. So it to me is it's useful when the problem is already kind of to some degree solved. And now it's just a convenience thing to put on top of you haven't already done a lot of the hard work to get people to trust the handful of tables they have or dashboards or whatever it is.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to pull in this question. So with capabilities like Gen AI and semantic models, do we really need a catalog, need to catalog that technical metadata at all? And what I wonder, Ben, on that point of, maybe you already need that trust in place and you're kind of just operationalizing it or productionalizing it. Is there a way, from what you guys are seeing with Gen AI in particular, is there a way that catalogs might actually be able to expedite some of that, where we're still building consensus, we're still thinking through how we build that trust metric or that knowledge bank? Do you see any, or do you have any signal in any direction that Gen AI would actually kind of be an accelerator of that process?
No. I don't actually see how Gen AI helps here. I'm not sure what Gen AI does for you here. In some ways, it to me makes things more unhinged, not less. Where the places where I've seen people attempt to use Gen AI basically in roughly this world is we can automatically create a bunch of documentation for you, or you don't need a data catalog because you could create the data catalog on the fly. Why I don't write down the things I find in Google. I just Google for it again. And it's basically the same idea, which okay, that makes some sense. But I don't know that really solves the problem for me. I guess like the only place where I could see Gen AI really helping here is in potentially if like, okay, Gen AI solves all the problems and just makes everything in data nice and neat and clean, and sort of it's like the equivalent of some, like general AI type of thing. Fine, you can kind of solve any problem that way you want. But if it's like actually just applying Gen AI to roughly the data cataloging world, the place to me where I can see it being useful is it's essentially like a search function across a bunch of different unstructured data sources that you have DBT jobs. You've got like stuff people wrote down in random Google Docs that you kind of absorb. You've got dashboards, and you can kind of like ask it to find me something in sort of a weird way. So yeah, this question, it's basically like a synthesis layer across a bunch of really disparate things. I could see it being roughly useful there. I don't really see that as being a catalog so much. It's more of like Gen AI based search across data assets, which is roughly what I think like Snowflake and Databricks are trying to do with things like their catalog-y stuff. But I don't know that really solves the fundamental problem of like, do I trust it?
I think there are, Ben, when you said the fundamental problem that data catalogs are here to solve is when I look at something, can I trust it? I think that's for one persona, which is the analyst persona. But there's also the central data team persona that's saying, why are my Snowflake bills so high this month compared to last month? And where does my sensitive data live? And so those centralized concerns are also things that data catalogs also solve for, especially the good ones, right? So some of the personas, depending on which persona we want to focus on, and I think we should focus on all, we can talk about different use cases and debate kind of the utility of information in the catalog, definitely. But coming back to the analyst persona, the question around, can I trust it? And your assertion that first trust has to be already existent for a catalog to add value on top. I think sometimes trust does not exist because there isn't visibility into how things flow. Now, this is true more for slightly larger organizations. I mean, if your data team is literally one person and a monorepo with DBT, and they know there's like 5 other people upstream of them, completely agreed. You probably don't need a data catalog to catalog the complexity of your data ecosystem at that point. But the moment you get into, even funnily enough, at Acryl, we're having the funniest of debates more recently around our community stats and our community analytics. And we're a team of 3, Maggie. And we literally were about to document some of this stuff and also look at the lineage of our, Fivetran to Lake and back up into Snowflake. Just simple, supposedly modern data stack with only 2 hops. And yet we find the need to actually use technical lineage to build trust in it. So I would say, at least even my current lived experience seems to indicate that trust, human trust, easy to get, but when it's founded on technical trust signals, it's way easier to get to. And that's what kind of a more robust catalog gives you.
So I make one quick point and have one question. The quick point I'd make is, I think that's true in like a bit of a atmospheric way, where there is a sense if something is monitored and there are dashboards around it, like, oh, we can trust this a little bit more because it's reliable and it's like sort of data driven, where instead of it's like a field-based thing. So I would agree with that like, yes, there is some version of that potentially it's like, oh, we've put numbers to it and charts to it, therefore like we trust it. Do we? I don't know, but like seems like somebody's paying attention. The second question I have is, I think your point about like, okay, we can track all these different things that are going on and there's trust in the system and stuff like that. That to me is expanding the definition of a data catalog well beyond a data catalog, and is starting to get into like, it's now a data catalog is actually this kind of like single pane of glass into your data ecosystem that tells you how different things are all connected. It's not so much like cataloging the data assets themselves, but is more of like the control plane for your whole thing. And so I think that to me is certainly valuable, but it starts to really stretch to me the definition of what a data catalog is into a data management platform or some other term that Gartner probably has a quadrant for that's got 40 companies in it. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Taylor, you had something you were going to say, so shut up.
Yeah, just on the point you made about kind of the lack of transparency, don't you think that that's a failure of BI tools rather than something we need another tool to do? Like if our tools that we're using to present data aren't transparent and don't if that's what you need to trust the numbers. And I think that's a failure of the tools that we're using rather than a need for something else.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't blame a BI tool for not having visibility into things that are upstream of it, right? So you generally connect the BI tool to your warehouse. And maybe the BI tool gives you beautiful lineage for all of the things that it is responsible for. But upstream of the things that the BI tool is consuming live other things that are perhaps transforming data in flight or defined elsewhere. And that's where I think the BI tool shouldn't be expected to understand where third-party data is coming from and transiting through multiple layers before landing in the warehouse.
I mean, I guess if you want to go like really far back, but I think in general, a lot of the stuff that we still go to catalogs for today, like columns and definitions and all this kind of stuff, ideally sits in the same context, which is one of the parts about like the experience that you mentioned. It's very out of flow and very kind of, I think, unhelpful in many ways to ask someone to gain that trust of one tool by going to another tool. And so I think there is more kind of that should be pushed to BI. I don't know if you see that then differently about where data catalogs sit. If you guys are using it as a way to trust numbers, ideally that trust is happening in the place where you're looking at the numbers to begin with, right?
I think BI tools are all great. I would never say. I mean, I think I understand your point. To me makes sense. I don't think I would say it's a failure of a BI tool. I actually would say it's probably like a failure of the data teams, which is not really any of these tools' problem. It's basically that like data teams will publish stuff in BI tools that is broken and they don't maintain and it continues not to work. Like if I go to a website and that website doesn't work, is that a failure of front-end technologies? Is that a failure of back-end technology? Like, no, it's mostly a failure of the people who built it to like allow a thing that doesn't work to get to me. And so I think like that's more of the issue to me is it's not the BI tool should be aware of this. To your point, Shirshanka, like that's too hard. It's really too hard for any of these tools to manage that. I think really that's a failure of like, as data teams, we have gotten for years, we basically are content to publish stuff to people that immediately breaks and we do nothing about it. And like, that's partly because the job has all these weird there's a bunch of weird structures to it where we like send out dashboards to people or reports that they can refresh on their own, but we stop maintaining and there's no line around production and we don't have any SLAs. And like the whole thing is we're sort of this weird consulting thing, but also product builders and nobody knows what any of it is. I think like that to me is the real problem in all of this is it's really just like nobody knows what they can trust on anything because it's all kind of half broken all the time. And we all sort of seem to be content with that. And like a BI tool is not going to fix that. A data catalog is not going to fix that. An ETL tool is not going to fix that. A warehouse isn't going to fix that. The problem is we just ship a bunch of broken stuff.
Well, the data catalog, I would argue, is in the best position to fix it because at least it's the only one with the express intent of trying to understand the entire journey of data, not just the data as it lives in the analytics plane. And so I think, this debate, this problem that we've had, is the classic OLTP, OLAP divide, right? You've got operational systems that are meant for transactional processing, and that's what they're optimized for. There's an entire line of business that's focused on that work, and they're using Pydantic to manage their ORM models in the database or whatever newfangled stuff is, how people build apps these days. And then you've got the entire data team that's responsible for taking the downdraft of all of that data that's generated by operational systems and then make sense of it all for the business. That's been kind of the responsibility for data teams forever. And what we continuously find, and it shows up in data quality problems as well, is that the stuff you can control and you try to make it as good as you can. And that's kind of tailor your point about let's make the BI tool more transparent and make sure we can trust the computations. And that's the scoped locally correct definitions and locally correct realities, but very much impacted by incorrect assumptions about the data that is feeding into those. So of course, there's like probably 80% of problems can be fixed there, but maybe 20% of problems are coming from upstream where someone went and stopped producing to a particular column because they moved from, user ID to user agent. And now that's the new column that brings in all the definitions. And no analyst could have prevented it because it just came in as a new column in a table, and it seems like a backwards compatible change, and you only can react to it later on. So that kind of problem, data catalogs at least are in a better place to solve if they go upstream of the warehouse. And that's why I think, Ben, to your point, I'm fully in favor of the catalog as an app on top of the control plane, because if you don't have a layer that can actually connect to all of these things and pull all this metadata into one place, then you cannot actually have a catalog that works for the enterprise. You only have an analytics focused catalog, in which case you're absolutely right. Perhaps a BI tool is just good enough, or if the BI tool is anyway responsible for all of the transformations, then it can also function as that internal catalog.
So there's an interesting point in that, and Taylor, I'd be curious your take on this. And this I think is one of my driving skepticisms behind data catalogs and things like data contracts too. Is you made a point that like a lot of the problems come from things like stuff upstream changes. The data breaks basically, and so everything breaks downstream because the data breaks. I actually would say my experience is the opposite of that, where like data breaking is actually a relatively small problem. Like pipelines will stop working in the sense that it just doesn't update. But then you're like, oh, it broke, and it's obvious because the number went from 146 to 0. And you're like, I think that's a data problem. The thing to me that makes much messier is less like the data broke and more revenue got defined in 8 different ways across a bunch of different dashboards because people did it at different points in time, and everybody kind of had their slightly different version of doing it. And it actually changed the way we want to do as a business 2 or 3 times. And like a salesperson inputted something in Salesforce wrong, or the close date's not right, and the close dates got out of sync. And like, it's not a problem of like data pipeline, or there's no technical problem in that. It's just like, we never really agreed to something, or we did and we changed it. And so it wasn't actually implemented right. It was hard to figure out what we do with all these weird edge cases about how we count leads in this particular way. Or like suddenly we got started double counting these leads because something weird happened we didn't expect. That's not a data problem, really. It's like we were trying to transform a bunch of data into a kind of complicated business concept that the definition for was always a moving target. And so stuff moves around a ton and none of it's ever consistent. Like that to me is a much, much bigger problem with this than the data breaks, which again is why I think like data contracts are like a useful but minor problem. They're like, okay, great. Something started coming in as a Boolean that used to be a string. That never happens. What happens is that like salespeople input stuff in Salesforce wrong.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's one of the things on the point earlier about kind of, we give out broken things. I think in my experience it's the same there. It's not necessarily like the number's wrong. The number could be right, but no one has any way of knowing what it is. So I think it is about like that understanding is the true value. I think a lot of times in the analytics that we're bringing is like, okay, we all have come together and we agree that this is now how we're going to define this metric. And we've like stormed through and we've worked it out. And now we can say yes. And then that lasts a lot longer than any of kind of like a dashboard or whatever, or even like a document about what metric, what revenue means. Well, that's helpful after the fact, but the value is in that discussion that you have where everybody agrees on exactly what you're doing. So I think anything that facilitates that, back to kind of that discussion piece, I think is, to me, where it all comes back to. Like you've just got to get people in the room to have that discussion.
So I'm going to pull in a comment here. So Lucas asks, says one of the main challenges that data catalogs face with engagement, not everything is automatic. A lot of maybe product managers or teams should fill it out. It's hard to drive them to action. Do you have some insight? It's truncated because it's a kind of a longer comment. And so I think this one's germane here because, regardless of where you're doing it in a catalog or otherwise, you're driving collective agreement and here's how we're going to do a thing. And so I'm curious, and we're going to treat this as kind of like the last kind of general topic to kick around, and then we can kind of go through some of the other questions in chat. So for folks that are in chat, feel free to keep asking questions and we'll get through as many as we can. But so long story short, my question is, how do you drive consensus in building these practices or these standards to define a metric, to agree on how you're going to, like what the KPI means and how it's defined within the data so that it's more reliable, et cetera, catalog or otherwise? What have you seen be successful in either culture building, tooling, automation, et cetera?
I mean, I think it is 100% culture. That is, tooling will reflect culture, full stop. And it does not make a difference what your tooling is. It is entirely culture. Like what do words mean? There is a dictionary that tells us that the youths don't care. They will use words the way they want to. And that is what those words mean. And like, we can tell them that that's not what they mean all we want. It ain't true. They mean what they mean. And like, I was just recently in India. In theory, you are supposed to drive on the left side of the road in India. It's kind of a loose rule. You kind of drive wherever you want. And like, there are rules to say drive on different sides of the road. And like, the culture kind of says, no, actually, like, it's a little bit more loose about what side you drive on so you don't get around traffic. And like, the rule doesn't matter. What matters is what people do. And I was like, in London, you're supposed to walk on the left side of the sidewalk. Nobody does that either. They kind of walk all over the place. And so there's just like, the rule doesn't, like, all that matters is the behavior. And I think that if you're going to do this, like, this is the thing that a metric means. You basically have to do it through just like hammering that culture over and over and over again, and talk about that metric and make sure everybody knows exactly that metric and what it means and what it should be and all those sort of things. Like, the tooling will just be a reflection of that.
I think I would also add, like, finding out why they don't want to do it. And I think underneath that, there will be a mistrust of something. Like, they either believe that this won't come into anything, it'll just be forgotten, it's not worth it for them, or they don't understand. So I think it is just about, if you can have a very honest conversation with them, which can be difficult to do, about what is it about it you don't want to do, or why don't you think it's a valuable thing to do, then I think you're able to kind of assure them that it is being used, and you can show them how it's going to be helpful to them. And I think that's how you, again, like on the bigger culture piece, I think if you're trying to change culture, it has to happen at a very small level like that. And they have to, okay, I believe you, I'm going to try it. And then you have to follow through, and it actually has to be useful for them. And then you kind of start to build it that way.
Shirshanka, before I go to you, I wonder, Taylor or Ben, is there a place for a catalog in either hammering in that culture or kind of understanding the why, right?
I think it's useful in that, like, it shows that you care more. Like, I think there is, like, having, hey, this is a thing we care about. We hammer it sort of in conversations and things like that is the stuff we talk about, but also it is written down. Like, there is stuff there that is valuable. Like writing it down to me is to some extent part of the culture of saying this is the thing we care about. If you're saying we care about it, we've never bothered to write it down, people will be like, well, do we really care about it? So I think like it is a signal in that sense. And certainly, like, it's not to say, like, sometimes people will look it up and they will find a document that says this thing. And if that document is wrong, if you always say it means one thing and it means something else somewhere else, they're going to get all confused and not know what it is. So I think like it is a useful tool here, but ultimately it's a tool to continue to push that culture as much as it helps sort of create the entire ecosystem of culture around that thing. To me, it isn't something where you can be like, well, the culture says one thing, but we wrote it down, so we should do that other thing. Like, the culture is going to be the culture, and this is just another way to do it.
Yeah.
Like, go ahead.
Okay. No, I was just gonna say, I broadly agree. I think it's everything in how it's being used. Like, if someone comes to you with a question and you say, I'm not going to answer that because it's in the catalog, then I think that's a very poor demonstration. Or if you say, let's have the conversation, oh, and by the way, here's a catalog where we keep this stuff, and let's add to it based on this conversation we had, then you are building on that. So it can be a part of whatever kind of culture you want to build. I think that's the nice thing about it, but it's very dependent on where you are and what you choose to do with it.
Yeah. All right, Shirshanka, take us home. What are your thoughts on using, any kind of insight you can share in kind of enabling people to really fill in the gaps of documentation or kind of collecting that knowledge or transferring that institutional knowledge, right? Like, any guidance you can give on how folks can kind of rally the troops around a catalog?
I mean, most of my guidance is based on just what I've seen in practice. Like, when I look at companies like, obviously LinkedIn, but, Etsy, Pinterest, Stripe, and a few other kind of big companies that have gone to like large amounts of success with this data catalog, like 1,000+ monthly active users, and you try to figure out what exactly did they do and how did they get to that level of success. A few things emerge, right? One of the things definitely is they didn't try to make it like a happy social place to have conversations about data. That was not how it started. It all started with first giving something that people found useful. And in some companies, that was something as simple like when you want to get access to a data set, this is where you go. Or something as simple as I'm an analyst and I'm trying to look at, and this is what we did at LinkedIn actually, for like analysts didn't like Data Hub until we built out one feature, which was we had this metrics platform that would compute metrics, and Data Hub would be the place they would go to look at whether that metric was refreshed for the day and what it looked like and whether all the windows had been computed. And it gave them a little button for them to request a backfill, something as simple as that. They found it useful. And then that brought them back. So once, and Stripe, has used Data Hub to do visibility into pipeline operations. So all of the data engineers go there to see if their pipelines are running on time and if they're going to end on time. So I think different teams seem to have found different ways of making it useful first before making it that central place where documentation lives and where this higher order human context starts living. So I think approaching it in that way, if you are trying to roll out a data catalog, is first try to give your stakeholders early value for things that they're already doing or critical workflows that they just need to accomplish, period. That I think is step one. And then step two can be what Taylor was talking about, which is you start building that culture in the act of answering questions. We had a very strange thing at LinkedIn. It was a somewhat promotion-driven culture is the wrong word, but at least promotions were an important thing. And so there was like a full-on committee that would evaluate, engineers going from staff to senior staff and senior staff to principal staff and things like that. And one of the things as part of the promo packet was your Data Hub profile, because we would actually go look at what data sets did you own, where they're well documented and things like that. And people would basically do a quick review of your work of the past year by kind of looking at what you accomplished. And there was just one place to do that. And that, again, led to a lot of people caring about how that profile looked. If you think about LinkedIn, why do you go and update your LinkedIn profile? Because you care about your image for the rest of the company or the rest of the industry. And that's kind of similar to what you can accomplish if you position the catalog in that way. So I think it's really a few different hacks. Pick your favorite hack as your first stickiness vector, and then kind of build from that is what I've seen most companies doing.
That's the first time I've ever heard comp evaluation tied to metadata. And that is wild. That is absolutely wild. All right, folks, we went pretty over. We had chatted earlier and I said, let's just keep it a loose 30 minutes. And, we went an extra 20 minutes. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. There are some really great open questions in the LinkedIn chat. So I will ask all of our panelists to make sure that you take a look at those and provide your thoughts after the fact so we can keep the conversation going. Most importantly, thank you all so much for joining us for our first episode. Taylor and Ben, it's truly an honor to have you join us for the conversation, for taking the time to chat with us. And yeah, I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you, folks, and we'll see you around.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.